Hello chess fans. Today I'm excited to show you a game from Paul Keres. Paul Keres is a player that I have to admit I don't know enough about, but I've always admired his games and been intrigued by him as a player. He's one of the greatest players never to have become world champion, often kind of in the top 5 of that list, depending upon who you ask. His opponent Laszlo Szabo was another great player from the 1950s, also a grandmaster. I want to give a little bit about Paul Keres before we dive into the game. Paul Keres was born in Estonia, although at that time it was part of the Russian Empire. And in the 30s, he was already one of the best players in the world. In fact, in 1938, he won the great AVRO tournament. Now, that was kind of supposed to, or at least thought to be, a predecessor to a match with Alekhine. By winning that tournament, he was positioned for a match against Alekhine, but because of World War II, that match never happened. After World War II, things were all changed around, of course, and suddenly Estonia was occupied by the Soviet Union. Keres was still a great player, but it's often thought that he was kind of stifled by the Stalinist Soviet Union at the time, and there was a lot of pressure on him not to best Mikhail Botvinnik in a situation where they were competing for the world championship title. This is all very difficult to prove, of course, but it adds intrigue to his great career. Ultimately, though, we have the chess games to look back on, including this one, and we are going to enjoy this one today. Paul Keres is playing white, while Szabo is playing the black pieces. We have a Sicilian defense, just like game 1 of Carlsen-Caruana from 2 days ago, and we quickly get, in this case, to a classical Sicilian where the 2 knights come out. Keres picks the richter-rauzer, here with bishop g5, kind of the most aggressive and natural option against the classical Sicilian. We're going to zip through a few more moves, and then we're going to focus a little bit on this move here, pawn to a6. Now, Stockfish and Keres and other analysts have suggested that this move is already the move that gets Szabo in trouble. I tend to agree, and I can point to both knight takes d4, queen takes d4, queen a5 as a superior alternative that gives black good development, or the move h6, disrupting this bishop. This h6 move is cited by Keres, and he gives a long line leading to an endgame that might be slightly better for white, but no more than that. Black seems to be able to develop okay in this position. For example, his knight has easy access to c6, which it doesn't in another critical line we'll look at in a moment. However, a6 happens, and I want to comment a little bit more on this move before we move on. a6 happens in a number of key Sicilian defenses. It happens in the Najdorf and the Khan, and I think many people throw in the move a6 in just about all the Sicilians they can play. I've often faced a6 in a dragon Sicilian. It's almost always wrong in that position, and in many opposite sides castling positions, it's actually a very slow way for black to achieve counterplay. That's basically the problem here. a6 just is not a fast enough move in terms of achieving counterplay, and Szabo is going to suffer for it. By the time we reach the end of this game, which is not going to be that far away because this is a miniature, you're going to see that Szabo never really got counterplay, and I think that the move a6 in this critical fast tempo opposite sides castling position is a big culprit in this problem. After a6, Keres plays the strong move pawn to e5. The pawn is captured, and of course Keres is not going to capture on e5. This simply loses a pawn. He's going to exchange on c6, which he does. Now, I think many of you might rightly wonder, why not exchange on d2? Now, we've often heard that in the Sicilian defense, if you can reach an endgame as black, you're doing very, very well. This is generally true, but it's not true in this case. After these forcing moves, black's endgame position is not really appealing. The basic problem is that his pieces cannot find good squares. Particularly this bishop is a really sorry piece that is restricted on the light squares. White has good ideas coming up, including knight a4 to c5, where his knight will dominate the bishop, and his rooks can dominate the d file. Black's knight looks like it might establish itself on d5, but it can always be evicted by pawn to c4. As a result, White has a really large advantage in this Sicilian endgame because of his better piece development and mobility. The sound structure and pawn weaknesses that White often has in the Sicilian defense, or that White is often going to suffer from as a result of playing the Sicilian defense, are not an issue in this case. Jumping back, Szabo plays the capture on c6, avoiding the exchange of queens, and Keres simply captures on e5. The knight now cannot run to d5 as it would like to, because after an exchange on e7 and knight e4, White's knight is going to establish itself on d6, which is of course very, very appealing. So the knight instead retreats to d7, and Szabo's idea now is going to be to put pressure on the e5 pawn. There's also, after knight d7, a crisis here with this attack on the bishop. Of course, what Keres does not want to do is exchange on e7, which would reduce a lot of his attacking potential and pressure. You might pause the video if you want to try to figure out what he played here. In this position, Keres played the natural attacking move pawn to h4. I think any of you with strong attacking instincts probably also selected this move. It should be pretty clear that Black cannot exchange on g5 because of bishop to d3, as well as queen to f4 and h4, and in general, the attack on h7 is going to come fast enough that Black simply will not be able to defend. It's a very common theme that you cannot help your opponent out by opening an h-file in a position like this. So instead, Szabo kind of ignores the situation with these bishops here for a moment, plays rook b8. Keres plays queen e3, inching his queen a little closer to the king side, defending e5, and lining up on the d file with his rooks. This is an excellent move. Queen f4 was also very, very good, and your computer might even like that more. Rook e8 is now played by Szabo. We might wonder, why not play h6, trying to resolve this situation? Your attacking instinct should be tingling here, and after an exchange on h6, I say exchange, I should say sacrifice, I guess, but this is not much of a sacrifice. After a sacrifice on h6, almost every white piece is ready to come in and deliver a decisive final touch. White is totally winning here, and you should expect, of course, that sacrificing a piece for two pawns like this, when you completely denude the opponent's king, should easily win the game, and of course it will here. Instead, rook e8 is played, and now this is another good moment to ask yourself, what did Keres play? He found, I think, the best move, and one that I don't know that I would have found, rook h3, an excellent move that considers rook g3 and other uses of the rook along the third rank. The rook on h1 was not doing anything, and developing the bishop might seem appealing, but the bishop could be a little bit exposed on the squares it could develop to, and it wasn't going to do a lot on those squares anyway. Much more to the point is this rook h3 move, which introduces a ton of attacking ideas that we're going to see play out in the game. After rook h3, Szabo plays queen to a5, putting pressure here on this e5 pawn, which of course, if he can force Keres to defend here, he would be doing well. Keres, though, finds the correct forcing continuations to avoid or to neutralize the pressure on the e5 pawn. First, he exchanges on e7. Black's rook now captures on e7, and Keres plays rook over to g3. The main theme here is queen g5. This would attack g7 with a threat of mate, and it would attack the rook on e7. Black cannot try to capture on e5, for example with queen takes e5, because after a simple exchange here, we have back rank mate here. Black can block with the rook, will capture, and it's checkmate. This is a nice use of tactics to further your strategic goals. Keres' goal here is to attack the black king in general, the g7 square in particular. Szabo is trying to attack the e5 pawn. Keres uses tactics to achieve his strategic goals of continuing his attack without taking any time out to play passive defensive moves that would pretty much have ended his attack. In this position, Szabo plays the move rook e8, getting away from the threat of queen g5. And this is my favorite move in the game. Again, I would suggest pausing your video if you want to try and figure out what Keres played right here. This may not even be the best move according to the computer, but that's only because of a very remarkable defense by black. Keres played the move rook takes d7. In this position, the black knight on e5 is Szabo's best defensive piece. It's attacking e5 and can jump back to f8 to provide a lot of defensive resources if it needs to. So Keres simply makes a very logical decision. He's going to eliminate it even at the cost of a rook. Of course, Szabo has to capture the rook on d7, and Keres plays the developing move bishop d3. At this point, all four of Keres' pieces are ready to jump into the attack against the black king. It should be no surprise that Szabo actually kind of crumbles very, very quickly here. Stockfish, though, does point out one defense. The move rook b4, lining up to defend the fourth rank here, is a brilliant way for black to save the position. One of the main points here is that after queen to g5, here we're attacking the g7 square. Black can play g6. Now g6 looks like it could be really, really bad because you're giving up this f6 square. But you're not able to get at that square in time because of knight to e4. The knight wants to go to f6, but we have rook takes e4 and bishop takes e4 and queen to e1 mate, a stunning reversal right here. Since we can't play knight e4, black is actually able to defend this position. For example, queen d8 also creates a situation where, of course, white doesn't want to trade queens, but the rook on b4 and the queen come together to try to eliminate the h4 pawn, which not only would capture a pawn, but more importantly, it would neutralize a lot of white's attack by introducing more defenders to the king side and eliminating a key attacking piece. Because of this, in a lot of lines, white simply has to bail out with a perpetual check with some sacrifices. Not this one right away, but there are some other lines where white can sacrifice and get a perpetual, but not more than that. So rook b4, I think, is really a 2 exclamation mark defensive try from black. Instead, Szabo plays the move h6, which is clever. Many of you might be wondering, why can't I take that? I have a pin on the g-file. You can take that, but then black captures on e5 because the white queen left this undefended. Black covers g7, and in fact, black should still win this game. Of course, Keres isn't going to fall for that. He plays the creeping move queen f4. Now he has ideas of queen f6 for a start, and black is without a defense at this point in the game. A move like queen to b4 here, trying to trade queens and attack on b2, could be met by queen to f6. We don't care about the capture on b2. That will not save black. Pawn to g6 in this position simply loses. Bishop takes g6 should be a move that you play in about a second. Again, the capture on b2 leads nowhere, and in this case, after the king simply steps out of the check. So, jumping back here, Szabo tried the move king f8, stepping out of the pin on the g-file and preventing white from playing queen f6 or queen takes h6. This is a position where I would really encourage you to pause your video. We've had several moments earlier where I think it's good for you to pause your video, try to figure out what Keres did, but in this case, I really would suggest pausing it and trying your best to figure out the winning combination here. If you're over 1600 or so, I'd really suggest not restarting the video until you feel like you have the solution. Maybe below that, this might be a little difficult. Take a good try and then come back to the video. The winning solution in this position is a really wonderful combination. Rook takes g7. a very nice rook sacrifice. This might instinctively seem like it's not going to leave white with enough attacking chances here, but calculation proves that to be wrong. King takes, queen f6 check, and black has only 2 squares to retreat the king to. If king g8, simply queen takes h6, and black is up a lot of material. It seems like black should be able to defend in this position. Really, it's just these 2 pieces that are attacking at the moment, but black has no defense. For example, queen takes e5 leads to a checkmating pattern that you should really either know or learn right now. After bishop h7 check, bishop steps back, king over, queen check, king over, queen h7 check. The bishop has used this little shuttle to coordinate with the queen to attack the f7 square and to deliver checkmate. It's kind of funny that in this final checking sequence, the queen over here on e5 was totally unable to defend the light squares. White was able to checkmate with the queen and bishop exclusively on those squares. Szabo instead played the move king f8 in this position. And now Keres played bishop g6. Kind of a quiet move, not a check, not a capture. Keres simply threatens mate here on the f7 square, and stunningly, Szabo, with a large army, has no way to defend this checkmate. The only real way to actually defend this square, rook up to e7, simply blocks the king's access to the e7 square. Queen h8 is checkmate, and the game is over. Because of this, after bishop g6 on move 23, Szabo resigned. I hope that you've liked this game. I have always found this to be a beautiful little miniature. I have a personal fascination with miniatures because they often demonstrate ideas in such a simple and succinct way that I feel like I can remember them a little bit better. In this game, you get to see the value of a rook lift. You see a really wonderful sacrifice to remove a key defensive piece from black. And you see a number of interesting strategic and tactical and checkmating ideas that you can use in your own games. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you are, or consider sharing it with a friend who you think might also like the video. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll see me again in a future video where I'll also be analyzing some more games from Paul Keres.